Hello, my name is Ryu, and this is my review. Simplicity can be a double-edged sword. It can be a powerful force in creating a cohesive experience, but can also result in disinterest. Jotun wields the double-edged sword well, but does not avoid being cut by its own blades. Jotun is an action-adventure game that is entirely based on Norse mythology. It's the story of Thora, the fallen warrior trying to regain her honor in death by engaging in glorious combat with the 5 Jotun, giants with different elemental powers. Most of the game is in its boss battles, which I will be discussing and displaying a lot. You have been warned. There are spoilers ahead. For those who are not interested in being spoiled, here's a short summary. I actually really liked Jotun. The aesthetic, story, and gameplay are all charming in their simplicity. However, it has one core problem that is a direct result of that simplicity. A large portion of the game is very boring. I'll explain why near the end of the video. The fact that this didn't turn me off to the game speaks to the credit to the rest of it. Now, let's get into the details. Normally, I would start with gameplay, but because most of the spoilers will be discussed in the gameplay section, and because it will be the longest, I am leaving it for the end. Jotun's aesthetic is a masterpiece. The hand-drawn character designs and animations are simple and clean. They seem like something straight out of Steven Universe or a classic Disney film. The toonish art style bursts with personality. The massive smile on Thora's face as she raises her axe screams triumph. The Jotun are fiercely emotive as they thrash about. My only complaint is that there are a few models that have very sparse animations. For example, the Jotun Fae has a very low animation frame count. It makes her fight pretty jarring and, at times, makes it difficult to predict where her attacks will land, particularly her shield. In comparison, the Jotun Hagalaz has a far higher frame count and is much more fluid during a fight. Whatever the reason for the discrepancy, it is very noticeable. The environments, also hand-drawn, are huge and manage to be very detailed while still maintaining their simplicity. They seem like something straight out of a storybook. Each environment effectively elicits a slightly different emotion, from playfulness to unease. The camera zooms in and out to emphasize landscapes, future areas, and points of interest. This really incentivizes exploration, and it is usually rewarded with a bit of Norse mythology. The music takes an appropriate backseat during exploration and becomes very forceful during the boss fights. It was composed by Max LL. It is often the only thing you can hear during exploration portions, aside from Thor's footsteps, that is. Yet it manages to be very passive. It's clearly meant to assist the zones with setting the intended mood. However, the music becomes forceful and invigorating during battle. The music also ramps up as the bosses transition from phase to phase. Each track is masterfully implemented into the game. They flow between each other as the environments change and as bosses become more fearsome. They even link up with boss actions. A perfect example is how the music is implemented into the Jotun Kanan fight. I couldn't find any seams in the tight crafting of the music. If Jotun's visuals are like a storybook, then its storytelling is like a heroic tale being told in a crowded, cozy inn. Thora narrates her journey throughout the game. Every time a Jotun is felled, she tells a bit more about who she was and how she died, all beautifully narrated in the Icelandic language.
Ég heiti Þóra og ég var fædd til að berjast. 9 stormasömum nóttum eftir fæðingu mína nefndi faðir minn mig eftir þrumuguðinum. Faðir minn var höfðingi þorpsins. Ásamt bróður mínum og áhöfn þeirra sigldi hann höfin á stærðarinnar langskipi.
After a dishonorable death, Thora finds herself in Ginnunngagap, the Void, a primordial realm where the world was created. She is tasked with impressing the gods in order to gain entrance to Valhalla, the Norse afterlife for glorious warriors. In order to achieve this, Thora must defeat the 5 mighty Jotun, Yera, Fe, Isa, Aglaz, and Kanan, as she collects their respective runes. Jotun uses Norse mythology well because of how simply it is presented. The developers clearly didn't intend to comment on the current understanding of Norse mythology or interpret its stories in any particular way. They simply decided to create a game about a Norse warrior as she battles demigods of legend. Simplicity at its finest. Again, simplicity is the recurring theme of Jotun. Gameplay is incredibly simple, right down to the basic mechanics. Movement is restricted to 8 directions, like older isometric games. Combat is similar to Dark Souls in that it consists of a fast weak attack, a slow strong attack, and a rolling dodge. There are also 6 simple abilities that can be unlocked through exploration. A heal, an immunity, a substitution ability that aggroes enemies and boss abilities which explodes when it expires, a speed boost for movement and attack speed, a damage boost with an initial explosion, and a homing spear. Each of these abilities have 2 uses, some of which can be upgraded to 3 and only recharge when you visit a shrine of Mimir, a counselor to Odin whose head was severed from his body and placed in a magic well. It was always a relief to come across a Mimir shrine after exploring a zone and, often, being near dead with no abilities left, even if he can be really creepy. While the combat and abilities are simple on their own, using them effectively has a decent amount of depth. There is always a Mimir shrine available immediately before a boss fight, so you should have full health and all of your abilities. You can do the boss fights in any order aside from the tutorial boss in the very beginning. The game suggests an order for you with glowing arrows, which I chose to follow. This is likely based on what the developers considered an appropriate difficulty curve. Each boss has a few simple mechanics that expand throughout the fight. They seem to be organized into 3 to 4 phases each. I would say that the difficulty curve for the tutorial boss and the 5 Jotun is very appropriate and effective. Each zone is designed to teach you a mechanic or 2 that will be used in the level's Jotun. And each boss fight gets more and more difficult as the fight progresses. Even the tutorial boss does a very good job of teaching you that the fights will get more difficult as the enemy's health gets lower, specifically that their abilities will get harder and harder to avoid. The tutorial boss and the 5 Jotun do an excellent job of cementing the 2 following values you should develop as the game progresses: patience and opportunity. You need to be patient during the boss fights by focusing on avoiding unnecessary damage, and you need to use the optimal opportunities presented to do as much damage to the boss as possible. Use your abilities intelligently in order to optimize outgoing damage, avoid incoming damage, and maximize your health pool. Each boss, while distinct by their own right, is very consistent. Every attack is well telegraphed and accurately defined. This doesn't mean the bosses are easy, don't get me wrong. Some of these attacks are very difficult to avoid, but careful planning effective use of abilities during opportune moments, and patience always led to success. It never took me more than 2 attempts on a Jotun to defeat them as a result of the lessons from the first attempt and the consistency of their attacks. Unfortunately, the lessons taught and consistency of the Jotun are betrayed by the final boss. I want to give a quick breakdown of my attempts on each boss. Undead Warrior, the tutorial boss, had 2 attempts. Yera, the Nature Jotun, took 1 attempt. Faye, the Cave Jotun, took 2 attempts. Isa, the Winter Jotun, took 1 attempt. Agalaz, the Storm Jotun, took 1 attempt. Kanan, the Fire Jotun, took 2 attempts. Be warned, I'm about to spoil the final boss. So, how many attempts did it take to beat the final boss? Odin, the Allfather, took 37 attempts. Whoa, you might say. Ryu, you suck. Now, I'm not super fantastic at video games, but I would respectfully disagree. I learned the mechanics of each boss, and if I wasn't able to adapt and beat each prior boss in 1 attempt, I beat them in 2. The game had trained me to treat the boss fights like any other action-adventure game. Patience and opportunity. But the final boss does 2 things that betray those values. It introduces unforgiving RNG and becomes a DPS race. In fact, the final boss is far more like a World of Warcraft raid boss than anything you might find in a single-player game. It strongly reminded me of the artifact challenges from Legion. Let me first explain why RNG comes into play. Odin only has 2 simple mechanics. He throws homing spears and summons images of the 5 Jotun to perform their signature attacks. The spears can be dodged with careful timing, but continue to orbit Thora until they either make contact or reach the edges of the battlefield. However, these spears can be incredibly inconsistent. The first strike is always predictable. You need to carefully time a dodge in order to avoid getting hit. The second, third, and fourth are quite unpredictable, however. Sometimes the spears will just casually pass Thora by. Other times they will turn on a dime and be nearly impossible to avoid. Sometimes they will come in 1 at a time and require 2 to 4 well-timed dodges. Other times they will all come in at once and either be incredibly easy to or nearly impossible to avoid. It's important to note that despite the simplicity of the spear mechanic, it is Odin's most dangerous ability by far, and will result in the most deaths. Odin's other ability, summoning the Jotun, is immensely inconsistent. There are 5 platforms on which the Jotun can be summoned. Which platform is used and which Jotun is summoned is completely random. At first, it will always be 1 Jotun. However, as Odin takes more damage, the number increases to 2, 3, and then ends with 4. When only 1 Jotun is summoned, the mechanic is fairly easy to avoid, as long as you are also paying attention to the spears that are floating around. The worst that can happen is that a Jotun that is close to Thora and has a large AoE, such as Yera, can force the use of an early speed boost, immunity, or heal. It is not until 2 Jotuns are being summoned that RNG becomes a huge problem. Sometimes the summon can be inconsequential, such as Isa and Kanan, each of whom only require 1 dodge, and sometimes Isa can go in a completely random direction. Other times, the summon can link 2 abilities that are extremely difficult to avoid, especially considering the spears. For example, Isa and Yera can be effectively impossible to avoid if one spawns near you. Once 3 Jotun are being summoned, it would take extremely good luck to not take a large amount of damage during each rotation. Most of the time, I did not make it past this first triple summon. Once 4 Jotuns are summoned, it is effectively impossible to avoid any combination, and immunities must be used. The other bosses have barely any RNG, basically limited to where stalactites fall from the ceiling. Odin is riddled with it. If this was the only major change, I wouldn't mind so much. It would still have been fairly beneficial to learn the boss's patterns. I would just have needed to be more patient and more on my toes. However, Odin is also a DPS race, and it's all because of the spears. Again, the spears take quite a while to disappear, and Odin fires them a lot. There can be anywhere from 1 to 9 or 10 spears on the field at any given time. Eventually, between the spears and the Jotun, it becomes impossible to avoid everything. Aside from the fact that summoning 4 Jotun at once is a hard enrage, having too many spears on the field is its own form of soft enrage. An enrage is the point at which a boss is mechanically designed to overwhelm the player. I had to take a totally different approach than the previous bosses, which is why my final attempt looked like this. Instead of practicing patience and opportunity, I prioritized doing as much damage as possible in the shortest amount of time possible. I allowed myself to get hit in order to do more DPS to prevent more spears from being introduced onto the battlefield. I bursted through as many phases as possible to minimize the amount of time in each. I even used the speed and damage boosts as a form of heroism cooldown combo. Those are WoW terms for doing a metric ton more damage than usual in a very short period of time. Of course, I still used my defensive abilities and heals when I most needed them, but most of my strategy had to be totally different from the previous bosses. Patience was useless, and there was always opportunity. I want to make it clear that I'm not complaining about the increase of difficulty. I would have been very disappointed if I would have 1 or 2 shot the final boss. It was still incredibly satisfying to finally beat Odin, but I would have much preferred it if the developers had stuck to the lessons of the Jotun. Here's one way they could have fixed the fight. Make the order and locations of Jotun summons fixed. Tune the spear patterns to be as consistent as possible. Double or even triple Odin's health. And increase the rate of which Odin throws spears and summons Jotun. This would have made for a crushingly difficult but consistent fight that would follow the rules for each of the previous bosses. Learning the fight would still have been a long and arduous task, but I don't think it would have taken 37 attempts. My playthrough of Jotun took roughly 5.5 hours. 2 of those hours were spent on Odin. That's more than a third of total playtime spent on one boss. Overall, it's an intense final boss fight that doesn't really fit with the rest of the game. While bosses are the meat of the gameplay, exploration will take up most of your game time. The zones leading up to each Jotun are huge mazes, each of which take a different form. Some have very simple puzzles, some have scattered enemies, and some have some pretty freaky hazards. The pause menu does have a map, but it doesn't indicate where Thora is, so you need to pay attention to the geography and landmarks to figure out her position. I appreciated this slight challenge. However, these exploration sections hold the biggest problem of Jotun as a game, and it's a direct result of its simplicity. Jotun couldn't avoid being cut by the double-edged sword. Exploration is boring. The zones are too big, are nearly empty, and Thora moves too slowly. Not every zone is empty, but once all enemies have been cleared, they don't respawn. Finding the rune in each zone takes a lot of time and is usually quite far from the entrance. Once you find the rune, you have the option of teleporting back to the hub world, but there are also a handful of secrets to discover in each zone. Finding the rune and navigating the maze already often takes way too long. Searching for secrets takes even longer. These are optional, but are still important because the final boss would probably be nearly impossible without finding all of the god statues, which grant abilities, and heart-contained golden apples, which increase Thora's maximum health. Though I'm sure some true champions of Jotun have beaten the game without unlocking any abilities or health increases. I am not one of those people. Aside from Odin taking 2 hours, each of the other bosses only took 7 or 8 total minutes to beat between 1 or 2 attempts, and I assure you, the puzzles and minor enemies that are encountered take very little time to get past. Most of this game is spent running through empty spaces. I'm not suggesting the developers should have added more complex puzzles or a number of enemies. That would have strayed further from Jotun's mostly positive simplicity. I'm also not suggesting the developers should have made the zones smaller. That would have lessened the experience of using the geography and landmarks to figure out where Thora is in each zone. Instead, I would have just increased Thora's speed when not near enemies. Perhaps she could have strapped her axe to her back, allowing her to move a bit faster. Even a 25% speed increase would have gone a long way to make the exploration a lot less boring. A simple fix for a simple problem. I really enjoyed Jotun. The art is beautiful and the music is great. The story is simple and effective. The combat has depth in its simplicity, and while boring, the exploration aspect did have its high points. It was simple fun, with a couple of simple issues that could use a couple of simple fixes. Thanks for taking the time to watch this. I hope it was interesting and/or informative. I will see you next time.